Welcome to episode 2 in this video series where we're talking about program design. In episode 1, we talked about training frequency, so if you haven't seen that video yet, click on the link below. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the second step in program design, which is exercise selection, or more specifically, how to use a movement-based approach to program design. A movement-based approach to programming is one where we define the fundamental movement patterns that we want to train and then select exercises to train these movements. Approaching programming in this way creates a classification system for all exercises, and that has two big advantages. Firstly, by defining movement patterns and then selecting exercises to train these movements, we ensure that we are stressing the actual body parts, joints, and tissues that we want to stress and training the actual movements that we want to improve at. Secondly, an exercise classification system that organizes exercises into categories based on movements will allow us to select the most appropriate exercise for ourselves or someone we're training, and will serve as a platform to regress or progress that exercise. If you skip straight to prescribing exercises and select, for example, a 2-dumbbell bench press, how do you know what you're going to progress to next or regress to if this exercise proves too advanced? So let's start by defining the movement patterns and then selecting the exercises based on these movements. Today we'll talk about the most fundamental or broadest movement patterns, but there's always going to be movements that fall outside of these categories, and we can refer to these as hybrid movements. Starting with the lower body, we have the squat pattern and the hinge pattern, and both of these can be done on 2 legs, referred to as bilateral, or 1 leg, referred to as unilateral. So here's an example of a bilateral squat, a unilateral squat, a bilateral hinge, and a unilateral hinge. Outside of these 2 main movements for the lower body, we can talk about other movement patterns like bridging, lunging, or step-ups, but these will usually have some kind of crossover to the squat or the hinge. For example, there is very little difference between a dumbbell goblet split squat, which might be referred to as a squat pattern, and a dumbbell goblet reverse lunge, which would be referred to as a lunge pattern. After this, we could categorize more isolatory movements that target single joints or muscle groups. For example, a lying leg curl that targets the hamstring group, a long lever Copenhagen plank that targets the adductor group, or an ankle isometric hold that targets the ankle joint and surrounding tissue. In the upper body, our main patterns are pushing and pulling, both of which can be done with 2 arms or 1 arm. But unlike the lower body, these can be done in the horizontal or the vertical plane. So here's a bilateral horizontal push, a unilateral horizontal push, a bilateral vertical push, a unilateral vertical push, a bilateral horizontal pull, a unilateral horizontal pull, a bilateral vertical pull, and a unilateral vertical pull. In the upper body, we also have the trunk or abdominal muscles to consider. In life and sport, the abdominal muscles serve to resist movement, so it's most effective to categorize these exercises based on movements that resist extension, called anti-extension exercises, movements that resist lateral flexion, called anti-lateral flexion exercises, or movements that resist rotation, called anti-rotation exercises. After this, we can again categorize more isolatory movements, such as ones that target single joints or muscle groups, which in the case of the upper body might be shoulder extension or flexion, or elbow extension or flexion. So now let's dive into the programming sheet and see how I would apply this when building a program for myself or an athlete. Here's the programming sheet that we saw in the last video, and this is going to be a similar program to what we talked about in the last example. This is a 4-day lower and upper body split, where on the first 2 days we're training power and strength, and on the last 2 days we're training strength and hypertrophy. So if we scroll down here to the microcycle information, we can see that what we've done first before plugging in movements and exercises is decide on some qualities that we're going to train. So on day 1 we're training power and strength in the lower body, on day 2 power and strength in the upper body, on day 3 strength and hypertrophy in the lower body, and on day 4 strength and hypertrophy in the upper body. Once we've determined the qualities that we're going to train, we can then start plugging in the movements, starting with day 1 where we're training lower body power and strength. We're going to start with an Olympic lift for the lower body. This could easily be exchanged for a loaded jump or other lower body power exercise. This is going to be paired with a lower ballistic movement, then a bilateral squat, then a movement that targets ankle plantar flexion, then a unilateral hinge, then a movement that targets hip adduction. On day 2, we're going to start with an Olympic lift for the upper body, then an upper ballistic movement, then a bilateral horizontal push, then a unilateral vertical pull, then a bilateral vertical pull, then a unilateral vertical push. On day 3, where we're training lower body strength and hypertrophy, we're going to start with a bilateral hinge, then a movement that targets the ankle, then a unilateral squat, then a movement that targets hip abduction, then for hypertrophy, a movement that targets knee extension and a movement that targets knee flexion. On day 4, where we're training upper body strength and hypertrophy, we're going to start with a bilateral horizontal pull, then a unilateral horizontal push, then a bilateral vertical push, then a unilateral horizontal pull. And then for upper body hypertrophy, we're going to use a movement that targets elbow extension and a movement that targets elbow flexion. And once we've determined the movements, we can then start selecting the exercises. So on day 1, the Olympic lift for the lower body is going to be a hang power clean. The lower ballistic movement is going to be a depth drop. The bilateral squat is going to be a barbell front squat. The ankle plantar flexion is going to be a dumbbell one leg ankle raise. The unilateral hinge is going to be a dumbbell one leg RDL. And the hip adduction is going to be a long lever Copenhagen plank. And you can repeat this process for day 2, day 3, and day 4, choosing your exercises based on the movements. And to highlight one of the big advantages of using a system like this, which we talked about earlier, which is that it is the movement selection that pilots the exercise selection, we can easily take out any one of these exercises and change it for a different one. For example, we could change the barbell front squat for a dumbbell goblet squat, which would be a regression of the same movement. Or on the other hand, for example, we could take out the dumbbell goblet pistol squat and change it for a 2 dumbbell pistol squat. And we can still be confident that in both cases, we're still training the same movement. And we could do that for any one of these exercises and movements in this list. Hopefully the programming example and the information in this video has helped you see the advantages of taking a movement-based approach to programming. Look out for the final video in this series where we'll talk about the last piece in the puzzle of programming, which is progressive overload.